Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. For our final presentation today, we will be showing you our project, Venetian Greenscape Reimagined, assessing parks, gardens, and other green spaces in San Polo and Santa Croce. And we'd like to open with this quote from John Ruskin, the author of Stones of Venice, who says, "The measure of a city's greatness is to be found in the quality of its public spaces, its parkland and squares."
We would like to begin with a little bit of history of private green spaces. Green spaces have existed all throughout human history, but typically these green spaces were private, dating back thousands of years ago to the Egyptian gardens, moving forward to the gardens of Sagiria in Sri Lanka, or even more modern in the 1800s with the Garden of Versailles in Paris. What all of these green spaces have in common is their limited access. These spaces are only available for the rich and privileged few who own them or have access to them. Generally, they were a symbol of prestige and wealth. Public green spaces, however, are a much more recent concept. With the shift from a farming society to an industrial civilization, the need for all people to have access to some kind of green space became more apparent. Green spaces offer many benefits to people. They offer an escape from the denseness and the pollution that is found within urban spaces. Additionally, people can recreate and socialize within these spaces. For an example of an early green space, we can head to the hometown of our university in Worcester, Massachusetts, where Elm Park was opened in 1854, making it the second oldest park in the United States and one of the oldest parks in the world. Venice's first public park, however, was built 44 years earlier. When Napoleon conquered Venice in the late 1700s, shortly after, he decided that he wanted to create a public park for Venetian residents to use. He chose a location in southern Castello, and with this location, he recklessly ordered the demolishing of a working-class neighborhood to construct the thoughtfully named Giardini Napoleonici, which was built in 1810. The space currently occupies as part of southern Castello, which some of it having been reclaimed land compared to the previous, compared to the previous version of the map. And this location is currently used to host the Biennale art exhibition. The difficulty that Napoleon faced, and the problem that we face now, is that there's minimal space to open new green spaces. Every brown dot on this map is a building, and as you can see, there's a very low amount of space in between these buildings. So we could, for example, follow Napoleon's footsteps and bulldoze San Marcos Square to construct a new green space, but obviously this is a completely ridiculous recommendation. What we could do instead is take a look at private green spaces. All across Venice, in between buildings, canals, and walkways, there are private green spaces. You can see the greenery peeking over walls all across the city. Many of these private green spaces have been opened in the past. For example, Giardini Papadopoli, which was opened in 1920, and Parco Villa Grogia, which was opened in 1975. Other examples include Parco Sabrognon and Giardini Reali. Another example of some private spaces that are opened is some palaces have little gardens that are opened temporarily during the Biennale. So these green spaces, whether they're private or public, need maintenance. And this maintenance depends on how it's owned. For private green spaces, the owners of said green space fund the maintenance. They hire gardeners. For example, local gardener Michele Savragnano, who is with us today, who works typically a few hours per each space during the week to maintain these spaces. Public green spaces, however, are maintained and funded by the city. The city creates contracts, and these contracts are picked up by co-ops. The co-op who is willing to do the maintenance work for the lowest amount of money will get the contract. For example, we met with Gabriele Zornetta, who is the head of the maintenance co-op Il Gruppo, and his co-op handles many of the public spaces in Venice. But if we are attempting to convert some of these spaces from private to public, the city would have to adopt the maintenance of these spaces.
Yeah, and That brings us to our two main research questions. Is there enough green space in Venice? And if not, which private spaces can be opened up to be made public? So WPI has actually been studying green spaces all the way since 2017, and this being the fourth iteration of this project, with previous groups surveying the Sistere of Giudecca, Castello, and Cannaregio. So the question is, in these previous three areas, was there enough green space? The World Health Organization recommends a 9 meter squared area of green space per resident. And you can see Giudecca exceeds this recommendation with an area of 14 meters squared per resident. Castello just meets the recommendation at exactly 9 meters squared, and Cannaregio falls very short of this recommendation of only 2 meters squared per resident. So onto what we did. We surveyed the two Sisteri of San Polo and Santa Croce. And in total, we have found 221 green spaces. And if you want to look at this map, in the center area is where there's a numerous amount of green spaces concentrated, which is because it's right near both the bus stop and train station. And this eastern side of San Polo, right near Rialto, there is a notable lack of greenery. Speaking of San Polo, it has a total area of around 300,000 square meters, housing a total of 9,000 residents. We have found a total of 76 green spaces in this area, totaling an area of around 25,000 square meters. Santa Croce, on the other hand, is much larger with a total area of 1.4 million square meters, which is due to the two industrial areas that were added. It has a much smaller resident count of only around 2,000 residents. We found around 145 green spaces, totaling an area of 93,000 square meters. So, for these green spaces, what data did we collect on them? First, we collected location data, where the green space is, its address, its total area. Next, we calculated its vegetation coverage, vegetation quality, flowers coverage. Next, we counted the number of certain amenities that would help visitors, such as benches, trash cans, and light posts. Next, we covered whether the park and green space was publicly accessible, as well as whether it had access for wheelchair and stroller users. Finally, we noted any maintenance needs we found, such as litter or any broken amenities.
Oops. So getting into the actual results we found from our surveying, we will show you our data broken down through 3 different categories, the first of which is type. And for type, we have defined green spaces into 5 categories, starting with gardens, which are places of vegetation for specifically aesthetic purposes and leisure, which differs from a park, which usually has wide grassy areas, making it more suitable for physical activity and recreation. Next is the designation of street space, which is vegetation situated along a street or walkway, often rows of bushes or trees. Urban wild is a mostly unmaintained, more densely vegetated area. And lastly, farmland is obviously for the growth of crops. So looking at each type, we found 142 gardens, 67 parks, which if you're looking at, you might be wondering why there are so many parks. However, this designation does not take into account whether the spaces are private or public. It's just purely from looking at it, which of our definitions it fits into best. Continuing with 7 street spaces, 5 urban wilds, and 0 areas of farmland. Here are all of those categories put together. And when we look at a breakdown of the total areas compared with each other, we can see that parks occupy almost half of the total area, even though they have a much smaller quantity than gardens. This is because they tend to be larger. Gardens is obviously the next largest area, with street spaces and urban wilds combining together to occupy about a quarter total. The next designation we're looking at is public accessibility. Public spaces are open to all tourists and residents for most hours of the day, whereas Hybrid is our designation for spaces that are open for certain individuals who are part of a group or maybe have a ticket. So this includes spaces like schools, churches, and some museums as well. Lastly, private spaces are not open to the public in any way, often just someone's backyard. So we identified only 10 public spaces in our area. Notably, Giardini Papadopoli is a recognizable one. Additionally, 10 hybrid spaces and a whopping 201 private spaces. And here's that map combined together. And again, if we look at the areas of each of those designations, we can see that private spaces occupy the vast majority of green spaces. The final breakdown we will be showing you today is condition. So we created a rubric with the help of data from past groups as well as our sponsor, Mr. Samagnano, in order to, in the least unbiased way, find a system for determining the condition rating for each green space. And this is broken into the categories that Jason described earlier. So beginning with unknowns, as I mentioned, many of the spaces were private. There were instances where we could see through a door well enough to collect the data we needed. We also utilized a 360 camera on an extending stick in cases where we really wanted data on a certain green space. However, we still have 165 spaces where we did not collect enough data to give it a condition rating. So moving on, we found no spaces that were completely poor condition, but 6 in fair condition, 17 good, 3 great, and no spaces that we thought were outstanding condition. Here are those combined together. And when we remove the unknowns, we can see that most of the condition ratings fell right in the middle of our scale in the good standing. So with all of the data we collected, we wanted to provide the city with some recommendations to improve the condition of existing public spaces. And so we did that both in a general scale as well as for each public green space specifically. So starting with on a general scale, we recommend that spaces add missing amenities that we think are important, such as park benches, as well as, in general, increasing the quantity of native plant species, such as jasmine and oleander, which can be seen here. For parks and street spaces specifically, we recommend that the city partner with local artists more often to install art into more of the spaces, such as this crab sculpture at Museo di Storia Naturale. And additionally, spaces that are fit to do so should host more community events, such as live music, in order to bring more people to the space. On an individual green space level, we did a similar process. So we will show you one example of this with a street space on Rio Terra de Pensieri. You can see here our original condition rating sets us at good, with particular weaknesses in amenities and vegetation. And so with our recommendations in those 2 areas, you can see that it is possible to bring this green space up to a rating of great. And so we did this process for each of the public spaces.
Continuing on with the recommendations of the World Health Organization in the area per resident, we analyzed that there was 10.3 square meters per resident in the area of Santa Croce, while there was a area of 0.1 square meter per resident in San Polo. That is likely due to the much higher resident count with the much lower total area. When we include the addition of hybrid spaces to look at whether or not there's enough green space in general for the residents, there comes out to be a total of 0.16 square meters, and with total green space, which is including all the private ones in addition to the public and hybrid, there is a 2.8 square meters per resident, which is still a far cry from the recommended 9 by the World Health Organization. All that means is that there needs to be a more incentive to make better use of what is currently there. So there was another metric we looked at, which is the proximity where people lived around green spaces. So using a metric of which publicly available green spaces had a good or better condition, and taking a 3-minute walk around those areas, we analyzed which areas were served by the green spaces that exist. As you can see, there are large areas here where there are not any publicly available green spaces for the residents. To combat that, we have chosen candidates that exist within these areas that lack coverage, and suggested some of them could be used to be opened and provide for the residents there. To be used for these recommendations, we chose that some of them, they would be of good or better condition and have street access, which means like a door on the street, so that they could actually be opened. We chose 5 candidates within the areas of Santa Croce and San Polo to make do. Most of these are currently private, with San Polo 2360 currently being owned by the high school, which can be opened on out-of-school hours and on weekends to make use for the residents there. Here is an updated map of the 3-minute walk, now including the data, the candidates we suggested. There's still some gaps around, but those areas did not have green spaces that met the criteria of being candidates. Now we can look at the improvement in area for the area per resident. We can see that in Santa Croce there is an increase to 10.7, and in San Polo there's an increase to 0.3. While it still isn't a lot, it does triple the currently available public green space in that area. Additionally, now that with the candidates to be opened, they would need to be maintained. For this, we talked to get an estimate on how much it would cost to maintain these. We talked to Mr. Zanetto, who gave us costs per about how much annual cost for vegetation there is. So there is around a 250 to 300 euro cost per tree, 10 euros per linear meter of bush, and 2 euros per square meter of grass. With 42 trees, 53 meters of bush, and around 950 square meters of grass, to calculate to a rough estimate of 14,000 euros per year, which is a far cry from the 5 to 6 million Venice already spends on maintaining green spaces already.
So in terms of communicating all of our results from the study, we created a few different platforms, the first of which is this virtual catalog that is available at this QR code. So this catalog includes profiles for all of the public green spaces we identified, as well as our condition ratings and recommendations. Here is a sample page showing Giardini Papadopoli. And you can see that it includes a description, location information, a list of amenities, as well as vegetation. And here you can see some additional photos as well as our rating system. The second platform we created, which is available here as of this morning, is an online database that includes interactive maps. So, and this also combines our data with the data of the past 3 iterations of this project. So, for example, this map allows you to swipe between the map of structures in Venice to reveal green spaces. So you can, and then the last feature of this database is called Find Your Nearest Park. So it shows all of the public green spaces across Venice and allows users to turn on their location data, from which they can click on individual parks and explore information about them. So that is our project, and to conclude, we believe that Venice's cultural significance should not be limited to its past, and we hope that our recommendations for the city will help to improve Venice's public spaces and promote its greatness for years to come. Thank you very much.